My name is Sarah Tass. I'm assistant professor of European and Comparative Administrative Law at Maastricht University. I have defended my doctoral thesis 2 years ago, a PhD that I wrote on the supervision of Europol's exchange of personal data that I concluded at the European University Institute in Florence. And my current research deals with the intersection of European administrative law, criminal law, migration law, and data protection. So this means that, more broadly speaking, I was very interested in the control and the accountability of EU agencies, so very much related to fundamental rights violations that the EU agencies are committing. And there I specifically focused on Frontex and Europol. But in the recent past 2 years, let's say, and also drawing from my doctoral research, I have focused more on the data protection aspect that takes place within migration agencies, but also Europol that has a bit of a migration role in some sense, let's say. And what I did there is that I tried to go into the technicalities of data protection in the sense that I wanted to see who exactly controls the data. So there is a lot of issues of controllership of the data that may take place between EU agencies such as Frontex, but also national authorities, as well as joint controllership. And more broadly, I also look at the data application of borders and more particularly the hotspots approach, which I will develop in the second stage of the question. To start with, I will develop and define what the hotspots approach actually is. So the hotspot approach was developed by the European Commission in its European Agenda on Migration from 2015. And what is it? It's essentially an approach that was developed to support frontline member states that were, let's say, facing a high influx of incoming migrants after the crisis that appeared in 2015 with all of the migrants, incoming individuals that wanted to enter the EU. So more specifically, the hotspots approach was developed in the European Agenda on Migration and also the explanatory memorandum from a commissioner, Avramopoulos. And what was clarified there is that 3 EU agencies, so I'm saying 3, it could be 4, but let's focus on 3 first. So we have Europol, Frontex, and at the time, the European Asylum Support Office, which now is the European Union Asylum Agency. They were supposed to help frontline member states in dealing with this influx of incoming migrants, essentially. Now, a 4th agency is actually mentioned, which is Eurojust. However, in practice, Eurojust, so the Agency for Judicial Cooperation, is not playing so much of an essential role. Thus, I think it's worth focusing rather on the 3 agencies, which are Frontex, the European Union Asylum Agency, and Europol. Now, what do they concretely do in the hotspots? So first, the hotspots have not been implemented, let's say, in every member state. So the member states that were facing a high influx of migrants are a bit the usual candidates, let's say. So we have Italy and Greece. So this is really where the hotspots approach was operationalized. And in terms of the role of the agencies there, they're supporting essentially national authorities. And to give you a bit of an example, they're supporting them in the identification, the registration and the fingerprinting of the incoming migrants. And an example thereof is Frontex, for example, so also called the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, but I'm using Frontex as a simplification of it, let's say, and it's the most commonly used terminology to talk about this agency. So what Frontex would do is that they would help, or even conduct in some cases, help the national authorities to conduct debriefing interviews, which essentially means that they will ask incoming individuals about the routes that they took, the modus operandi with whom they took, the reasons why they decided to come to Europe, essentially. And in these debriefing interviews, as you may well imagine, there might be information about cross-border criminality. So there I'm thinking about migrant smugglers. So who actually helped these individuals entering the EU? Did they do so through a legal route, a so-called illegal route, let's say? And this information will later on be shared, for example, with Europol, which is the European police, essentially. So I already hinted at the datafication, I think, of the hotspots. So more broadly speaking, each actor that plays a role in the hotspots will play a role in the collection as well of data. So now I gave you the example of Frontex, but the European Union Asylum Agency also plays a role with data in the sense that it will help in the admissibility interviews. And as you may know, or as you can imagine, in admissibility interviews, the individual may share a lot of personal data about their names, their country of origins, etc., etc. So this is a bit the background. Now, if we go into the legal issue, or at least issues in terms of data protection, every time a data processing operation is being taken, so the more steps you have in the data processing operation, the higher the risk towards your data and essentially towards data protection. So the higher the violation of data protection rights. So if we think about the risk of accuracy and lawfulness, I think the main issue there is very much about the lawfulness of the data, and I will explain a bit what I mean. So there are some scenarios in which, for example, as I told you, Frontex is the one responsible to support national authorities in the debriefing interviews. There have been, however, testimonies where, for example, staff members from Europol, so from the police office, joined these debriefing interviews and gathered personal data in an unlawful manner, since they shouldn't have been there in the first place. So this was then, well, noticed by an accountability forum, let's say. We don't need to go to the details into that, and later on remedied. But this is one of the instances where the lawfulness of the data collection might be put into question. Another instance that was recently raised actually by the European Data Protection Supervisor, which is the main central external supervisory authorities that is monitoring essentially the compliance of EU agencies' operations with data protection rules. So the EDPS recently reprimanded Frontex, actually, and again, I'm not going to go so much into the details, but simply put, Frontex, when collecting data during debriefing interviews, essentially about cross-border criminality, which is then the task of Europol, would automatically share them with Europol. Now, why is this a problem? Because ultimately we do want to fight migrant smuggling, we do want to fight trafficking in human beings. Yes, that is correct. However, the issue there is that they were doing so in an automatic manner without ever checking whether this transmission was actually necessary. So this is one of the key principles, a key data protection principle. When you are sharing data with another third party, let's say, and here in this case Europol, you need to check that the sharing of data is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, the data would just be shared at a tremendous pace. And as I said, every time there's a new data processing operation, there is a higher risk of data protection violation. So this was one of the issues that the EDPS pointed out, and he reprimanded Frontex for it. And Frontex has now been working on improving it and does not share automatically this data with Europol anymore. So this is a bit of another example. However, the examples are quite wide, because every time that there is, as I said, a data processing operation, there might also be issues of data accuracy, and this is the second part of the question. And the data accuracy comes into play first and foremost because we're interviewing actually individuals that are in a vulnerable position. So ultimately, the people that are incoming Europe are very scared of being sent back to their home country, or have faced a very difficult route, or are not really in the right state of mind to be able to conduct in an interview the best way possible. And there comes the issue of informed consent as well, as they might not always know what they're consenting to, as they just want to essentially get food, maybe get water, etc., and enter the country essentially. But they might give data that is either inaccurate because they were in a difficult state of mind, or they might give it without realizing what they actually have consented to. So these are a bit the data protection issues, some of the data protection issues that arise within the hotspots approach, but they are way more numerous ones that could have been mentioned. When it comes to supervision, I have already hinted at the main, or the most interesting, let's say, supervisory authority that plays a role over the hotspots approach, or in the implementation of the hotspots approach, which is the European Data Protection Supervisor. However, of course, in the hotspots, there are many levels that are kind of interacting. So we have the national level as well as the European level. So we would have, similarly, in the supervisory authorities, we would have national supervisory authorities, as well as European supervisory authorities. Now, I will only focus, and my research mainly focuses on the European level. And when we think of the European level, we have, of course, the European Data Protection Supervisor, but we could also mention the data protection officers, which are internal supervisors that are within each agency, so within Frontex, within Europol, within the European Union Asylum Agency, etc. And we have the European Parliament, which I think plays also quite an interesting role. Now, while there has been some supervision and supervisory work that has been conducted over the hotspots, and I just mentioned one in the previously, essentially, on the EDPS's role over the information sharing between Frontex and Europol, there has been a bit of a limited supervision, and this has been quite criticized by academics in general. So the EDPS has conducted some work over Europol, has conducted some work over Frontex, but usually it covers their processing operations more broadly and not so much what is happening in the field in the hotspots. So sometimes a paragraph might mention what is occurring in the hotspots approach, but it remains quite limited. So we have a bit of a supervision, more on Europol than on Frontex. However, Frontex is also coming a bit about in the work of the EDPS as well. But the main criticism that one could make is that while we have a lot of supervisors that are there, they tend to either lack expertise sometimes, lack resources, and this is one of the main issues in supervision, because there's a lot that needs to be supervised. However, when we think, for example, about the Frontex data protection function, they are, if I'm not mistaken, 2 or 3, and they have to deal with an extensive amount of processing operations. So they have to pick and choose. They cannot be able to watch over everything. So there's a bit of an issue of resources. There's an issue also with the supervision being sometimes rather a soft supervision. So the point of supervision is not so much to punish an authority, but it's more so to guide the authority to do better. So due to this lack of enforcement powers that many supervisory authorities tend to have, even if supervision exists, it will not always be characterized as efficient supervision, essentially. And if we then go a bit beyond, there are also a lot of processing operations that take place in the hotspot, which will ultimately never be supervised. And this is what I call the so-called blind spots of supervision, essentially. And just to give you an example, you can imagine that when staff members are working on the field, a lot of the exchanges might actually be done on an informal way rather than formally. And if this is done in an informal way, we will never have proof of what has actually been exchanged. And it is very well possible that at some point they end up talking just about an incoming migrant, some personal data that they might have obtained, but there's no written kind of piece of information on it. And this will never even be within the sphere of supervision, as the supervisors will never even be aware of it. So this is one of the issue. And more broadly, I think as a kind of a concluding remark that one could do on supervision is, while there is some progress that is being made, the complex legal framework that is the hotspots approach, essentially, with all of these different levels of actors, and I haven't addressed it so much, but there are a lot of different levels of legal frameworks as well that are in place, and a lot of opacity that is surrounding this hotspots approach, make it ultimately quasi impossible to deliver an efficient supervision, and because only by being aware of what is wrong can good supervision actually be made.